Hi guys. Yeah, welcome to the video on Burroughs' Ghost of Chance. I hope you have enjoyed the book. I know it can be a shocking book in some ways, but yeah, I think it's a really great book, and I think it actually jumps into very kind of contemporary literature, right? A very kind of contemporary set of questions that we have, right? And concepts that are important here to keep in mind about our, what people call postmodernity. I really do not like that term. I think it's too broad, right? But it points to some traits of literature and culture, right? At the time, at our present time, even though Burroughs died in the 90s, I believe 95, and this book is from 91, right? But it's still very close to us, 30, more than 30, how many? Oh, yeah, 30 years later. Anyway, so concepts that we're going to keep in mind here with this short lecture that I'm going to give to you. One is the concept of the post-human, and I'm going to write it down here to also to keep track of it. The post-human, right? Like post-human studies are a lot of different kinds of studies and scholarship that is being produced about climate change, about thinking also beyond anthropocentrism, right? Like thinking also beyond the idea that, after the Enlightenment and Renaissance, the idea that everything turns around men, right? It also has to do, of course, with cybernetics and robotics and all the things that, or medicine and advances in technology that take us into a different kind of way of being, right? One that you can that is linked to a lot of contemporary developments that we have, and for example, with the one that is linked to a lot with sci-fi, right? And you could say that this book is also a little bit of a sci-fi novel, right? So anyway, that's one concept to keep in mind: the post-human and post-human studies, right? Linked to what we call the Anthropocene, right, which is the study of how the new geological era that we're already living in is the one that happens after the effects of mankind on the planet, right? Like, and again, something that we can see a lot these days. Because we're talking about nature and animals and so on, they started to do this outside, and there are a bunch of bugs. So sorry if you hear that. Anyway, that's one concept. The other one is a concept that is important in literary studies as well and in philosophy, and is the concept of autoimmunity, right? Autoimmunity, and it was a concept analyzed and examined and worked on by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. And it comes, yeah, from the sciences. It comes from biology, right, and medicine. The idea of an autoimmune disease, the idea of a disease that attacks the immune system, right? But it is used also to understand how different things, also culturally, do the same thing, right? Like, for example, you can think in terms of like how humankind attacks its own self, attacks, and up to the border of extinction, right? Like, so you can think about it in terms of wars, you can think about it in terms of pandemics, you can think about it in terms of personal things, like the moment that we are self-destructive, right? Like that's something that reflects very well the notion of autoimmunity, and we see it a lot in this text. The idea of the immunity and what is how to be immune to some things, and it talks a lot about different diseases, right, that come back and attack these systems of defense, right? Um, and then of course animal studies, right? Like animal studies is another branch of studies right now where we are again linked to the post-human when we're trying to understand and read animals not anymore as just something to be hunted, killed, eaten, right, or for entertainment, right? So like the wave of let's say animal pro-life studies that we have been or thinking about, like just think about in the last 50 years, 60 years, like the decadence and finally rejection of things like bullfighting, right? Veganism, like the spread of veganism and vegetarianism, right? Like, and a lot of things that where we are trying to conceive of our role in the earth not as anymore as the biblical command of like commanding the animals, right? Of having like a hierarchy over them, but to think ourselves more into an environment, right? So Burroughs is thinking a lot about this in this text, right? And you see it also where we see the boundaries between animals and meats and plants, right? Like being split or not split rather, but like being dissolved, getting blurry, right? So like we see this at the end, kind of these diseases or kind of different hybrids that are mentioned that are human plant kind of like things, as well as human lemurs and other kinds of lemur. The lemur being this kind of particular kind of animal that close to the human, but not so much as would a monkey would be or a gorilla would be, right? And also having the particularity of being isolated in Madagascar, right? So marking this kind of point of suspension of life outside of the human, right? That at the same time, and that is threatened by the existence of humans, right? Like the existence of culture as violent as is depicted by Burroughs, right? So Ghost of Chance deals with all of these things, right? And then it deals with a lot of things about Burroughs' own life and trajectory that I don't want to get too much into it, because the problem with Burroughs, as great of a writer as he was, as I mentioned some of like anecdotes, is that he was such a big personality that it's very easy to just get kind of like sucked into his life and things that he did and how it happened and so on, instead of focusing on the text. So I kind of wanted to focus on the text. A lot of things we see, for example, are the idea of agents and like transnational organizations and boards and systems of exploitation, right? So there's a talk about the board. The board appears as what we would talk as the man, right? But like kind of like in a global idea. It's very conspiratory, right? They're kind of like the evil people behind the decadence of life and that kind of like, again, autoimmune disease that humans become, right? Like humans are seen as precisely the autoimmune affects that are killing life in the whole planet, right? Then we have the guardians, right? Like this kind of idea more of an ancient culture, right? Like that is trying to protect the earth. So it goes back to like some of our traditional ideas of Gaia and like the earth as like linked to some more uh, friendly and like nature and life conscious individuals, right? So you can think about that in terms of a lot of narratives and films. Like you can think about the Alien movies, especially the second versions, like with Prometheus and so on, where you have this race of beings that are supposed to try to protect life in the universe and so on, right? So there's that notion. Then there's this very interesting notion of the Museum of Lost Species, right? Which is pointing, of course, to the great extinctions provoked through hunting and also to what we call in animal studies, like there is a reflection of mass production of meat and cattle and so on as pretty much like kind of like a holocaust of animals, right? Like so if you see, when we look at mass production of chicken and so on, like the conditions can be assimilated for some writers and scholars as to a kind of like concentration camps or like camps of death, right? So anyway, so like the Museum of Lost Species is kind of this space that, and Louis already made this very important point about temporality in this text, right? And the Museum of Lost Species is kind of this museum, this place where like they are alive, right? So time is suspended, right? And that goes precisely to the title of the book, right? Like let's talk about Ghost of Chance, right? And how the best friend of Captain Mission is this lemur, which the word lemur, and I think Louis actually in the questions asked pointed to this, right? How if ghost means lemur, right? So ghost, a lemur would be a ghost, right? So here that we have to reflect is why is it ghost, right? And it's not only because it's spooky or something like that, but I think what Burroughs is getting at it here is that a ghost as a specter is something that haunts you from the past, right? And it can also go towards the future, right? So there's also another kind of theory, also developed by Derrida, called hauntology, right? Like, so the idea that like our logic, our way of being is always haunted by ghosts, right? Like the ghost of history. Think about Marx, right? The ghost of pandemia and sicknesses, right? Like think about what we're going through right now, that we knew it, like, as, I mentioned before, when you think about Bill Gates, like 4 or 5 years ago, saying like this is going to happen, right? Like ghost of things that can come, but also ghost of what could happen, right? Like right now, when we talk about economical problems and we talk about a revolution, right? So we have the ghost of the revolution, right? The beginning of the Communist Manifesto, right? A specter is walking around Europe, the specter of communism, right? So there's a lot of significations of the term ghost, right? That are always talking about what haunts rationality, what haunts reality, right? Like something that is not palpable, that is not empirical, but it still affects us completely, right? Death in itself is ghostly, right? We're always like haunted by it in some way or other. So that's one thing. The other thing is ghost. And Burroughs was a very well-read person, and he knew he was always playing with language in some way or other, right? He has that. I quoted yesterday in my radio show, has that quote of language is a virus that comes from outer space, right? And we'll talk about viruses in a second. But he also thinks about ghost in terms of Geist, right? And Geist is the German term for ghost, but also for spirit and also for mind, right? So when you talk about the ghost, you're also thinking about like rationality, the mind, the spiritual side, right? You're thinking about all these things. And what is interesting is that he gives these things in this book, right, to the lemur, right, like to the animal, right? It's not the human, right? The human is rather this disease, right? So, and that affects temporality, right? Like the hauntology, the spectrality, what is the time of the ghost, right? The time of the ghost is a time beyond the present. The time of the ghost is a time that spreads from the past, from an immemorial past, right? Like the Big Bang, think about it, the, Ice Age, like all the prehistory and events of history, and the end of times, right? Eschatology, right? Apocalypse, right? So we think about that, especially these days where we're like, oh, this is kind of the apocalypse, right? We have that temporality, right? Like it's a very strange temporality. That's another reason why we are so spooked by what we're living through, right? So we have that, right? We also have a notion of how this board, right, like this organization, is trying to pretty much control dissent, right? Like the idea of dissent, the idea of the people realizing how they're being controlled, right? And there's a mention there, of course, about the war against drugs, right? And as you know, as well educated that you are, that was the thing in the 80s, right? Like that was the thing, the whole idea of the war on drugs, part of what it created with, mass incarceration, systemic racism, right? Like it was this pretext to keep the oppression, right? Like keep a system, a hierarchical system of oppression going on, right? And it's complex in many ways, but Burroughs back, because he died in the 90s, he was in his 80s, I think. Don't mind the dogs running around. There goes my dog. Burroughs knew that there was a manipulation going on in that sense, and he was a former junkie. He wrote a book called Junkie. He knew drugs really well, and the market of drugs and so on. And he saw that there was this political gain and let's say not only political, but what is the word I'm looking for? Like cultural, economical gain, right? Like, because that's the other thing, right? Like we talk about terms of economy and the terms of like how much alliances are between the narco and governments and so on. So he saw this as well. Then of course there are all these reflections about like what is like the biopolitical, but almost in a bioepistemological, right? Like what he talks, the think disease, right? This idea of a disease that is thought and is pretty much marked by repetition, right? Like the idea of habit and repetition is something that we saw in other authors as the disease that doesn't allow us to come out of this situation, right? And then, yeah, so like that's part of, again, going with that idea, that quote that I told you from another novel by him about how language is a virus, right? The idea that language is a virus in the sense that we cannot get out of our own culture, or improve or get out of bad situations like exploitation and racism and homophobia and so on, because we are just kind of like a code, like a computer code, right? Like we're just like codified in this virus that doesn't allow us to move beyond it, right? Like, so another reason why I always say it's good to learn another language is because you manage to like find at least another kind of virus or code that is going to modify your own and then allow you to see other things, right? So that's very important. The other things in the book, sorry about all the dogs, which although I think is very appropriate. But the other thing about the book, right, is are all these like biological diseases that make, poor Louis was saying how they were like really going to stay there forever in the minds, right, because they are so gruesome. But yeah, it's kind of this part of how we can he tries to kind of like link not only like the biological side of the body and the chemical side, as the chemistry was for literature and philosophy always like a huge enigma, and what it will show also especially was the complete lack of control that humans have at the end of life, right? Like the idea of however much they can think and philosophize, at the end, like the body's gonna go back to the chemical, right? Which is, it's gonna die, like it's gonna disintegrate, and there's just so much that we can control on that, right? So Burroughs plays with that a lot, right? And makes it this cultural thing, right? Where the body's going bonkers, and it's becoming like just like a giant like penis, or it's becoming like this hairy thing, right? And those diseases and biological like haywire processes are also describing kind of obsessions and cultural drives, right? Where the human who believes is in control of life and his body, etc., just is not, right? So that's another part that is very important for us, especially in this post-human literature that is trying to question precisely the whole enthroned and supposedly independent and mature human who controls everything and the universe and so on, right? So anyway, that's part of this, right? So that's pretty much what I wanted to tell you guys. I don't want to make it this longer than I wanted to. I'm looking forward to the conversation. One thing also Louis mentioned is the visuals. And these the drawings and paintings that you guys see in the book, they were made by Burroughs. It's here in the back, illustrations by William S. Burroughs, right? And so there's this, again, to go back, and Louis mentioned this, to go back to the idea of like questioning of language, right? And questioning of how language is restrictive and how it can just create these like cycles, right, of bad situations, of bad politics, of bad cultural milieus and interactions, right? Up to the point where, like, for Burroughs, or at least for this character, like humans become this disease because they are these, like the language. Sorry, Prospero. The language of the human, as it has been represented in history and philosophy since the beginning of writing, right? There's a part here, for example, page 8, right, when it says, in a muted, ghostly room, the custodians of the future convene, keeper of the board books, mektub, right, comma, it is written, and they don't want it changed. Mektub is Arab for it is written, right? So the idea of the virus that is the human is pretty much the virus of its culture, right? And its culture as it is the written culture, right? When we talk about history against prehistory, is because it's before prehistory is before we write, right? So the idea then of, is there an escape to this, right? And Louis mentioned that, and a point will be the what is non-written, what is not language, right? So images will be that, right? And that's something that you will see in modernism a lot, as like the last resource is to go beyond linguistic kind of art and understanding into a visual, plastic, right? Tactile, right? Haptic, as it's called, right? So that's the other thing that we see here, right? And this attempt to do that, right? An attempt to think in a different way, right? So, yep, that's pretty much it. Like the main things. Again, it's a very complex text. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a different kind of literature, and yeah, I'm looking forward to our discussion. Sorry, I went a little longer than expected. I have my T-shirt with my paintings from the caves, so to talk about the prehistory and the images, right? So yeah, and sorry about the dogs. I hope you could hear me. And looking forward to our discussion. Stay safe, guys.